start our next part of the course, and it's called the court system. As I told you, the United States has two court systems. The first is the U.S. court system, and the second is the state court system. Now, it's important to understand before we start the court system, to understand how the United States was organized. So please put in your notes that the first government in the United States was under the Articles of Confederation. Under the Articles of Confederation, power resided with the individual states, and the federal government had very limited power. Because the feds had very limited power, the states often did things on their own. It got so bad that George Washington, who's considered the father of the country, realized unless they did something about the Articles of Confederation, that the country would fall apart. He and some others, meeting in secret, decided that they needed to change the Articles of Confederation, and they came up with what is called the Constitution. Now, there was a lot of opposition to the Constitution, and so they published, to convince the American people to approve the Constitution, they published a series of articles in newspapers all over the country under different names, Alexander Hamilton, arguing for acceptance of the Constitution. These articles laid out why the Constitution was better than the Articles of Confederation. Because of this, at first, many people still were opposed to the Constitution because they felt that the Constitution protected the rich and not the poor. Because under the original document of the Constitution, only those who own land, could vote, which meant that only about 1% of the country could vote, because only about 1% of the people in the country owned all the land. So people insisted that there had to be changes. So in order to convince people that the Constitution was the best, they decided a promise. They promised to amend the Constitution, and this amendment became what we now know as the Bill of Rights. Notice it says amendment, meaning it was added to the Constitution. It was only because of that promise that the average person approved the Constitution. And the Bill of Rights has become one of the foundations of the American legal system. Now, under the Constitution, the government was divided into three parts. The first was the legislative, which was Congress, and the Senate, the House of Representatives and Senate. The second part was the executive, that was the president. And the part that caused the most controversy was the third part, and that was the judiciary. Many people, because of their trouble with the English courts, did not want a national judiciary. They felt that if you had a national judiciary, the next thing would be a national police department. And they were afraid of that because during the rule by England, the English used their soldiers as a national police department. But what made them accept the third thing was practical. It was based on economics. For example, it was safer to trade with foreign countries than it was to trade in the United States. So if you were a businessman in New York and you shipped goods to Virginia, and in Virginia they didn't pay you, you had to go to Virginia to sue, which meant that if you were from New York, your chances of winning were very limited. So what they needed was a neutral forum, a place where citizens from different states could sue without being worried about prejudice or the deck being stacked against them. So the federal court system was created as a neutral party so that disputes could be settled within the states. In other words, it was economic because that meant that goods would be shipped within the country and people would feel safe trading within the country because they had a neutral forum to settle disputes. So take this down. Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution provides that there shall be one Supreme Court and such other courts as Congress shall create. Under the Judiciary Act of 1789, Congress created a complete federal court system. This system was based on what is called circuits. A circuit is a grouping of states, territories, possessions, and the Commonwealth. There are 13 circuits, remember, 13 original colonies. These circuits, each circuit has one U.S. Court of Appeals, the second highest court, and at least one U.S. District Court, which is the trial court. Now, these are the primary courts of the United States: the Supreme Court, the U.S. Court of Appeals, and the U.S. District Court. But the United States also have what is called special federal courts. These courts have been established by Congress and have limited jurisdiction. Okay? Number one, the U.S. Tax Court. The U.S. Tax Court hears cases that involve federal tax laws. The next is the U.S. Court of Claims. And it hears cases, civil cases brought against the United States. The third one is called the U.S. Court of International Trade, which hears trade disputes between the United States and other countries. Next is called the U.S. Bankruptcy Court. And next is called the U.S. Court of Military Appeals. And a new court is the U.S. Court of Veterans Claims. Now, to learn about these courts, we should study each court separately. Now, it should be noted that judges on the U.S. District Court, the U.S. Court of Appeals, and the U.S. Supreme Court serve life terms, may not have their salary reduced, and may only be removed by impeachment. What is impeachment? It's a trial by Congress. The special purpose courts, judges serve fixed terms. Some courts, the term is 30 years. Some other courts, it's 15 years. Now, let's take the U.S. District Court. The U.S. District Court is the U.S. Trial Court of General Jurisdiction. There are 94 U.S. district courts. There's at least one in each state, and of course in the District of Columbia, which is not a state, but there is a court there. The second one is called the U.S. Court of Appeals. It's an appellate court. An appellate court hears and reviews the decisions of the trial courts. There are 13 U.S. Court of Appeals. The 13th only deals with one subject. The Court of Appeals can be composed of from 3 to over 30 members. New York State is in the Second Circuit, which includes Vermont and Connecticut. Now, the Supreme Court. Let's take this down. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the United States. It's composed of 9 justices appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. Justices on the Supreme Court serve life terms, may not have their salary reduced, and may only be removed by impeachment. The court decides which cases it will hear. The cases must involve a question of federal law or disputes between the states. It's an appellate court, not a trial court. What cases the Supreme Court, the justices decide by majority rule. Therefore, to win a case in the Supreme Court, it must be by majority rule. The Supreme Court hears cases involving disputes between citizens of different states, disputes between states, cases involving federal law, both civil and criminal, and most importantly, it hears cases involving the U.S. Constitution. This is why it's important that you read in your textbook the case Marbury versus Madison. Marbury versus Madison is one of the most important cases that the Supreme Court has ever heard. This case established something that's not written in the Constitution. What did it establish? It established, number one, that the Constitution is the supreme law of the United States. And number two, which is the controversial part, is that only the Supreme Court can determine what it means. Now imagine this. If you're the only one that can tell someone what something means, what does that make you? It makes you supreme. If you look in the Constitution, it says that each branches of the government, the 3 branches, are equal. But in this decision, the Supreme Court said that it was more equal than others. Because of this decision, almost every major occurrence in this country has come through the Supreme Court. It was the Supreme Court that has determined many of how we live. In Dred Scott, it determined that people, African people, who were called Negroes, were not citizens and were simply property. In other words, it affirmed slavery. In 1896, it changed its mind. Plessy versus Ferguson, after slavery, it ruled separate but equal. And separate but equal, people could be treated differently because of their color. It changed its mind again in 1954 when it ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that segregation was illegal. Now, this court has had more power and probably the most powerful institution in the country. That's why we have large numbers of lawyers, because lawyers recognize where the real power is. It's not the president, because the Supreme Court overruled the president and forced him out of office. It's not Congress, because the Supreme Court can rule that legislation passed by Congress is unconstitutional. So the real power in the United States, if you're studying power, is the US Supreme Court. Its power was so strong that in the 1920s, because of many accidents crossing by cars, crossing railroad crossings, the court came up with a rule that said that when people got to a railroad crossing, they had to get out of their car, look both ways, put their ear to the track to see if they could hear a train coming, and only then could they proceed. In Plessy versus Ferguson, not only did it rule that separate but equal, but it affirmed probably one of the most horrendous things in the United States, which was called the Asian Exclusion Act, which prohibited Asians from moving to this country and living here. Many Asian men who had come to build the Panama Canal were stranded in this country and could not bring their wives or their families here. Many who were promised by working on the Panama Canal that they would be allowed to enter the United States were not allowed and wound up moving to South America and Central America. That's why if you travel to Central America, South America, the Caribbean, you'll see a lot of Asian people. Many of them came working on the Panama Canal. Also in separate but equal, we found disproportion, because it never was equal. And matter of fact, in Brown versus Board of Education, the case was not won on the basis that discriminating against people of color was wrong. It was based on the fact that it was not equal. So that separate could not be accepted unless it was equal. That's why the whole issue was called Brown versus Board of Education, because black schools were inferior than white schools, even though blacks had to pay the same taxes and meet the same obligations as whites. Almost every major decision that we've had in this country has been made by the Supreme Court. Its power is such that if you ask most people who are the Supreme Court, most people won't know. They meet in secret. They decide which cases they will hear. And they determine. If we've been following things, most times legislation is passed and people wait for the Supreme Court to rule on it. These 9 justices are the most powerful people in this country. Almost every major decision has come from this court. And unlike the president, if you dislike your president, you can vote him out after 4 years. You dislike your congressperson, you can vote them out after 2 years. If you dislike your senator, you can vote them out after 6 years. But if you dislike any of these justices on the court, you have to pray for divine intervention, because life for these judges means life. The first justice of the Supreme Court came from New York. But the most important justice was from Virginia. The longest serving Chief Justice in the United States was John Marshall. Marshall and his decisions shaped what we now know as the United States legal system. Marshall was a very interesting man. He served as Chief Justice for over 34 years. He was appointed by John Adams, the second President of the United States after Washington. And Marshall was a cousin of Thomas Jefferson, but they didn't get along. He was closer to Adams, who was an opponent of Jefferson, than he was to Jefferson. If you study the court system, the U.S. court system, then you have to study Marshall. Marshall shaped what we now know as the U.S. legal system. Now we will start in our next video on the New York State court system.